Good afternoon, everybody. This is Justin Roth with JamPlay.com, back for week 9 of Expressive Acoustic Guitar. We are going to continue on with something we started last week, this tuning, this altered tuning, C, G, D, G, B, D, from low to high. Last week we played it, I learned chord shapes and stuff, how to play it out of the key of G position, which is using that open G chord. Now we're going to play it out of the C position today and kind of look at how some of the chord shapes are the same, and actually some of them are even easier, I think. There's a few more little things, convenient things that go along with this, playing it out of this key shape. And so this is just kind of showing us how we can utilize taking an altered tuning and not necessarily being stuck with playing it out of one key position. Now the thing that this playing it out of the C position, this is going back to kind of how we started with Dadgad, in the sense that now we're using this low string that's tuned all the way down to C as the root of our 1 chord. So that now, while like last week it was different because we were using the 5th string as the root of our 1 chord for the G chord. So what this does is, as I mentioned last week, is that in this tuning, when we played it out of the G position, the tricky thing about this tuning, which it has its own pros and cons, is that it has a 3rd in the tuning when we play it out of the G position. It has this B natural, which is the 3rd of the G chord. So when we played in Dadgad, we didn't have a 3rd in the tuning at all, so the tuning didn't know if it was major or minor. It was not trying to pull us into one key. So this tuning played out of the key of G position, as we did last week, is really convenient because it's always kind of pulling us back to G because that 3rd is there. Now when we play it out of the key of C position, this B string doesn't pose a problem, but it's something we have to be wary of, that because essentially playing out of the key of C, that B string is a major 7th. Whether or not we talk about the theory, or if you understand the theory or not necessarily the important part at this point, but we essentially have 2 really dissonant notes, or an interval that's built into that. So we're always going to be conscious of where we're fretting on that B string for most of the chords that we're going to play. So we're just going to get started. I'm going to demonstrate what some of these chord shapes are. And then one thing that's really cool about this playing out of this position is there's really more like 2 chord variations, 2 chord shapes that we essentially have to learn, and that gives us 6 of our chords. So we've seen this before in the other tunings where some of the shapes stay the same as we go up the neck. Granted, this gives us at least the first incarnation of some of these chords, and then there's other voicings that we'll get to. So for starters, and maybe we put that chord chart up now too, so that we've looked at that last week. On that chord chart, it has both the key of G position and the key of C position. And for this one, for the 1 chord, as we can see here, oh great, it's down to 1 page. We look at just that first column here. We'll start with that. Think of it, I mentioned this last week because we had this same chord shape last week, but it was the 4 chord when we played it out of the key of G position. So this shape is going to be familiar to you. And we have the option, as I mentioned, that anytime we're fretting the top string in these tunings, we always can kind of experiment to say, like, what if I don't fret the top string? Because these tunings are giving us these droning strings, which more often than not, that top string is going to be one that's going to work the easiest with a lot of the voicings underneath it. So I tend to fret that 1 chord without fretting that high E chord, or high E to high E string, pardon me. But that chord shape on the screen shows that fretting it on the 2nd fret. So, and I like to think of this as saying, oh, it looks just like an A minor 7, just how you would play that in standard tuning. So again, our left hand is somewhat in familiar territory. Granted, we're playing a completely different chord. So let's focus on the 1, the 4, and the 5 chord. Now this is a chord position that is more or less going to stay the same for all 3 of those positions, at least how how they interact with one another, because except for on the one chord here, we're not having to bar a chord to get our bass note. But this relationship is going to be the same. So if we look at the 4 chord, going down, oh, this what's on screen doesn't have the numbers next to it, but go down to the 4th chord down, built on the 5th fret. You'll notice this shape right here is identical to what this was down here at 1, except I'm not having to bar because I'm using the open strings. So if I played the 1 chord with these 2 fingers instead, if I wanted to do that, I could simply slide up to the 5th fret and bar that with the 1st finger, and it's going to be the exact same chord relationship, or from string to string. The fretting is related. And so there we have our 4 chord. Now we could do this one of 2 ways to get to the 5 chord. As we've seen before, the 5 chord is 1 whole step higher than the 4 chord. So this is where I'm talking about where the chord shape could stay the same, and I could simply slide this up 2 frets and have the option to not fret the top string if I want, the high string. That shape stays the same. So essentially the 1, the 4, and the 5 are exactly the same shape, just positioned in different places on the neck. Now, the easier way to play the 5 chord, as you'll see in that first column, is that free chord, the look mom, no hands chord. So we have that option as well, and that definitely comes in handy for a lot of different things, which I'll get to later. So there we have our 3 major chords in the key of C. C, the 4 chord would be an F, if we need to know that. If we don't, we can just rely on knowing that this is where the 4 chord position is, and the 5 chord there, or open. So now let's look at the 3 minor chords, the 2, the 3, and the 6 chord. We'll touch on the 7 chord, as I mentioned in the other alter tuning workshops, that we don't play that one necessarily that often. However, if you find yourself loving it and you play it all the time, I would love to hear about it. I would love to hear a sample of how you use it. But so our 2 minor chord, let's start there. And this one's really great because this one moves all around and will essentially work. Once we get this fingering down, we get to use it in 3 different locations, and we are set with all 3 chord positions. So the 2 chord, built a whole step up from our C. So this is essentially a D minor, because our 2, our 3, and our 6 are the minor chords. So I tend to use the middle finger on the 2nd fret, barring the bottom 2 strings, the low 2 strings, using my pinky on the D string, or yeah, it is still the D string because we haven't retuned it, but the 4th string on the 3rd fret, and my index finger on the 1st fret of the 2nd string. And so in this chord position, our 3rd string, the G, and our 1st string, which is now an open D, are both ringing. And I'm fretting the other 4 strings. And that's going to be the case for all 3 of these positions, for the 2, the 3, and the 6. At least for this voicing that I'm demonstrating now. So if that's our 2 chord, our 3 chord going up the major scale is a whole step higher, so our 2 frets. I'm simply sliding the entire thing up 2 frets. Now, and remember that in these alter tunings, in the chord shapes that I'm demonstrating, I'm not labeling these as to whether there's a 9th or a 7th or a 13th or anything like that, because those numbers can tend to be intimidating. Right now, we're getting started with falling in love with some of the easiest way to fret some of these chords in this tuning while playing out of this key position, the C position. So if we want to know what those notes are, maybe I'll touch on that later, but I don't want to throw out a bunch of theory too early. Right now, I just want you to be listening to the sound of what we're getting, and with the convenience of these chord shapes. So our 2 chord slid up to there. Now our 6 chord, we're going to have to go up the major scale. 4. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Means it's built on the 9th fret. Now the first column that's on the screen over there, oh look at that, he magically put in the Roman numerals. The 6th chord, the first column that's written there, is actually a different place that we get to play this chord, but I want you to look at the 2nd column of the 6th chord because it's the one that's related to what we just played on the 2 and the 3. So if we go back to this shape, 2, 3, and our 6 minor chords built on the 9th fret in this voicing, exact same relationship or chord shape that we're playing with this hand, with our left hand, and we're still letting that 1st string and the 3rd string ring underneath all of it. So there we go. We have one chord shape, and we use it in 3 different places, and we've got our 3 minor chords within this key. So now, if we go up that scale, starting at C major, we have C major. The 2 chord is D minor. The 3 chord is E minor. The 4 chord is F. The 5 chord is G. The 6 chord is A minor, and our 7 chord would be B diminished. So as a refresher, the diminished chord is essentially a minor chord, so it has the minor 3rd in it, but it also has a flat 5. So in this position, as we've gone up the neck, our relationship has always been, in this tuning, a root, a 5th, and the next string is going to be where the 3rd of our chord is. Not when I'm not fretting it, but when I play the 1 chord. That 4th string, that's where my 3rd is. And and all these voicings, we remember, the way we can remember these shapes is that to turn a major chord, like this C major, into minor, we have to flat the 3rd. Which just basically puts whatever what fret we're playing on the 4th string is only a half step up from the root of the chord. So our 2 chord is minor, which is why this is only a half step up on the 3rd fret. 3 chord is minor. 4 chord is major, so we go back to 2 fret difference. 5 chord is major, and the 6 chord is minor. So now if we go up to the 7 chord, which is going to be another whole step up, just a half step below our octave of the C, we're going to have, that's our bass note, we have that minor 3rd, but in order to flat the 5, if we remember that we've got a root, a 5th, and a 3rd in this shape, we have to flat the 5, so we have to put it 1/2 step lower. And I'm using this to bar, now I'm actually fretting the open G string, or the 3rd string. Just because that voicing, it works, it's just kind of a little bit of a leap to have that 4th string, or the 3rd string rather, be considerably a lower note below the voicings that we're doing. But totally fair game to leave it open. And now, this is where that 2nd string, open 2nd string, the B, it actually works. We can let it, we don't have to fret it because the chord we're playing is a B diminished chord. So we're playing a B in the bass, and now that open B string works. That's not to say that the open B string doesn't work over other ones, but now I'm going to demonstrate that in a little bit because it just starts to add a kind of, you could simplify it and say a kind of a jazzier sound to some of these chords, because being that it's a major 7th above our low C, the way that note is going to relate to these other chords as we go up the neck in this key are going to cause a little more tension than, say, when we were in Dadgad and the open strings were either a root or a 5th of the chord when we played Dadgad and D. They just kind of work a little more conveniently with the chords underneath it. This one works conveniently, but the way that it relates to the other chords, it causes a little bit more dissonance, which can be a good thing. That's something that we'll get for free if we so choose to use it. So now I want to demonstrate another variation on our major chords, which is really convenient to get to once we know these minor chord shapes. So let's go back to the 2 minor chord. Excuse me. So as the simple cheater explanation without having to get into the theory of why it works or what the notes are doing. For our 3 minor chords, our 2, our 3, and our 6, a way that we can play, it's the relative major chord, which maybe you're accustomed to hearing when you talk about music, hearing about relative minor chords. And I alluded to it last week, where the relative minor chord of a major chord is 3 half steps down. So for example, in standard tuning, G major, the relative minor of G major, you'd go 3 half steps down from G, and it would be a minor chord. So that would be E minor. And that, works at whatever major chord you start with, 3 half steps lower, minor chord, that is the relative minor chord related to that major chord. So now, and I'm going to ask you to kind of think of it backwards now, just for the sake of this tuning and playing it in this key, is the exact opposite would be true. So if we've got a minor chord, here's our 2 minor chord, or we could call it D minor, but right now we're trying to learn just what the shapes are called as opposed to where the notes are and what note we're actually playing. The relative major of any minor chord is you're going to take the root of this minor chord, go 3 half steps up, and make it a major chord. That will be the relative major chord. So, from the 2, 3 half steps up, make it a major chord. That's our 4 chord, remember? Built on the 5th fret. So the same would be true. Here's our major chord. 3 half steps down, turn it into a minor chord. That's the minor chord. Now again, without getting into too much theory, the reason those chords are related is that in any chord we have a triad. We have a root, a third, and a fifth. So in a major chord, let's say our 4 chord, and this is where we have to know what the notes are just to understand this concept. But in general, you'll be able to always know that how the relative major chord and the relative minor, how they relate to each other. That is the key to just remembering whether or not you know what the notes are, but I just want to demonstrate. So within a triad, in the F chord, without me counting out and figuring out where the notes are, because I'm in a different tuning, I can just say an F major chord, it has a major third, which is 2 whole steps higher than the F. So going up the scale, F to G to A. So A is our third. And then 3 half steps up from that is the 5th of the root of our chord. So F goes up, the third is A, and the 5th is C. F, A, and C. So now the reason why the major chord and its relative minor are so similar is that the notes of the relative minor chord, and this is D minor, is D, A, and F. So it has A and F. It has 2 of the 3 notes the same. They're just in a different, they hold a different role in this chord. So we have, basically, you have 2 chords and you have 2 of the notes that overlap, and only one of the notes are actually changing to hint at whether it's the F major chord or if it's the D minor chord. That is why these chords work so conveniently together. So now, going back to what I was saying, is that now that we know these minor shapes for the 2, the 3, and the 6, all we have to do to play the relative major chord to this, again from the 2 chord, the relative major would be the 4 chord, is I only have to change 1 note. And I could keep a lot of the same fingering the same. So, and it may not even involve, and for these examples, it doesn't even involve fretting a different note. It's just eliminating 1 note. So, if this is our 2 chord, and for the sake of just to explain this, I'm going to tell you that this going from low to high, this is a D, that's our root. There's an A, that's our 5th. F is our 3rd. And then the other notes above, some of them are suspensions. So we're just going to focus right now on that is our triad right there. We have a root, a 5th, and a 3rd. So if I know that the D minor has D, A, and F, and my 4 chord is an F chord, it has F, A, and C, I can just eliminate the bass note because that's the D note that's not in the F chord. So here's my chord shape. All I'm going to do is move my middle finger and not fret the low string at all and not play the low string, now I still have my A and my F. And this other note that I happen to be covering with my first finger on the B string, on the first fret, is the C. So now I have my triad for the 4 chord, but it's called an inversion. Just to throw that out there for those of you who understand inversions. If you don't worry about it. What it's essentially doing is the F chord, the F obviously would be the root. A would be the third. But as I demonstrated here, this lowest note that I'm playing right now is the A. So it's essentially an F chord, but it has an A in the bass. So it's first inversion of an A chord. But all the notes are still there to say that this is an A chord because I've eliminated this low D. So now, if that's my 2 chord, by eliminating that low D, I'm essentially hinting at the 4 chord. But it doesn't feel that way because you don't hear the bass note as the lowest note that I'm playing. And this is something that's great in whatever tuning you're in or standard tuning. There's chord inversions all the time. In standard tuning, I can't play it because I'm not in standard, but if you know when you see D/F sharp, that's D in first inversion, meaning that the D shape, again, I'm not in the right tune, so I'm not going to actually play it, but our D chord, when we learn this other variation where we put our finger on the 2nd fret, which is essentially the 3rd of the chord, or the F sharp, that's what the F sharp means after the slash when it says D/F sharp. It means it's a D chord with an F sharp in the bass. So again, I can't play it, but that's what you've probably learned some of these chords in standard tuning without even necessarily realizing it. But that one involves quite a finger change. You have to not only play a new note, but you have to move 2 of your fingers to get it. The great thing about this now, to do this inversion, I just have to play less, and I get to the other chord, but my position gets to stay the same. And the same thing's going to work. So that's the 2 chord. That's another variation of the 4 chord. Now the 3 chord is a minor chord. The relative major of that, going 3/2 steps up, is essentially the 5 chord of this key. So again, they're 3/2 steps apart, so that's how they're related. So the same thing's going to work here. There's my 3 chord. If I eliminate the bass note, I'm still playing the triad for the 5 chord. They sound almost identical, but they play a different role just by eliminating that bass note. Now the really great one is when we get up to the 6 chord. The 6 chord, the relative major of that, brings us back to our 1 chord. Back to the C. If I fretted it up that high, or it's back here. So the relative minor chord of C major is A minor, right here, which is our 6 chord. So now what I get to do on this one is kind of like a really great trick. And same thing as the 2 and the 3. I could say I'm gonna not fret the lowest string, but because I'm going from an A minor to a C major chord, and my low string, open string, is a C, I get to actually play the low bass string now. So I can go from the 6 to the 1. So there we go. We're hinting at all these chords, only having to learn a couple of shapes, or to learn a shape and then simplify it to be able to allude to its relative major chord.
Hello, Justin. We have a couple questions.
We have some questions.
Quick.
Okay, yeah. I thought once I start talking theory, I don't want to get too far into it without seeing if there's some questions and not lose people. So.
None of them are about the theory. This is a really random question, and I don't expect the answer is yes, but can you play the intro of My Sacrifice by Creed using that tuning?
I don't know. I do not know how to play that song.
I suspected. Okay.
However, maybe what you're hearing, though, is that you're maybe hearing some chord sounds that seem similar. So chances are, like, once we start listening to these tunings and learning some of these shapes, you may start noticing that about even more songs where you're like, oh, this reminds me of another song, because the sounds we're able to get out of these tunings become kind of a signature sound that really works well for some songs. As I mentioned, the last 3 weeks, like not every one of these tunings makes every song better, but it could be the magic sauce that makes that particular song that you're working on really stand out and have a signature sound. And maybe that's what your ear is hearing here. You're hearing sounds that are familiar and sounds that you've obviously liked enough to notice. And so if you're hearing some of the similar things, might not be surprised if there's at least a somewhat close relationship to the tuning that they might use for that song.
Okay, and here's a question. I already told this person which tuning we're in, but she or he was wondering, what is the purpose that we are in this tuning? Like, what is the main advantage of this tuning?
So the main advantage of any altered tuning, and in this course we've talked about dad-gad tuning, and now this one, which again from low to high is C, G, D, G, B, D. So it doesn't really, it probably has an official name, but you can't just like pronounce it. As opposed to dad-gad, which was D-A-D, G-A-D from low to high. So the purpose of it, and the purpose of everything that I've presented in these last 9 weeks, is to hopefully give you tools and choices to try on different songs to get sounds that you can't get out of standard tuning, or can't get out of standard tuning with a partial capo or whatever. The purpose is to give you options. It's not a musical band-aid that makes everything better. However, there are some things that it gets you things that you would not be able to play otherwise. So in the ends justify the means. But you don't know what the end is until you've experimented around and does it work with the song that you're working on or a song that you're writing. Does it actually bring benefit to it? So, and the purpose is, to make your guitar sound rich and lush, and to get people to like pay attention and go like, wow, I've never heard a guitar that sounds like that. So hopefully that works out for you as well.
All right, those are all the questions now. For those of you who are new here, we do take the questions and we just kind of wait till there's a slightly good stopping point to ask them. So if we don't ask your question right away, don't freak out. We're going to get to it. And as we always like to say, there's no such thing as a bad question. So if you have a question, ask it. If we don't know the answer, we'll be honest and say, I don't know.
Yeah.
And if we do, we'll help you out.
Yeah. So I'd love to have any questions that come up. I know I've kind of talked a lot about having to mention some theory things, and I just throw that out there, not to say that you have to understand that in order to do this, but for those of you who have some theory background, I want to be able for you to help you connect those dots. So just know that whenever I'm talking about theory, it is not the essential thing that you have to wrap your head around in order to experiment with any of this stuff. In the end, the goal is with these chord shapes, and once you know how to get in and out of these tunings, is to start learning these shapes, and the fact that a lot of these tunings, or I guess the 2 tunings I presented, have a lot of chord shapes within each key that are very similar. So it's not like you're learning, 7 new chord shapes for each key position. Sometimes we've only had to learn 2 essentially, and 3 if you want to play the 7 diminished chord. But 98% of the time you could get by on those 2 or 3 shapes in these tunings. So that is also maybe the purpose of presenting this material to you, to say like, here's a lot of sounds that you can get without a lot of new chord shapes. So so when I put out the theory stuff, it's just for those of you who have your a little bit of background in that, and just to help connect those dots. And that's also trying to completely eliminate talking about the neck necessarily and like where all of our notes have moved to. I just want you to focus for now getting started with the shapes, getting comfortable with them, and falling in love with the sounds that you're able to get. The further theory and how to like continue to tweak these chord shapes and to add different sounds is where the theory part really comes into play. And so I'm just trying to touch on it without having it be an essential thing that you have to know to be able to get started with this. So well, another great thing is maybe we can do that chord chart again. Is how all these chord shapes that I demonstrated were built off of the low string going up the neck. But some of the chord shapes, in particular the 5 chord, obviously have that option to play the open strings, that open G chord, because our top 5 strings are a G major scale or G major triad. It only has 3 notes in a G chord, a G, B, and a D. So the great thing about that chord, the hands-free chord, is it becomes, when you do hit that 5 chord, it becomes this great passing chord that you're able to sit on without having to, your hands free, and get to your next chord. And what I love is going for that 5 to the 1 chord, and this is going back to incorporating our hammer-ons and pull-offs that we covered back in, I think, week 3. So here, in any of these chord shapes that we've looked at, we have the option again to use any one of those strings as, or any one of those fretted notes as a hammer-on or pull-off. So going from the 5 to the 1 chord, as long as I hit that bass note, I can kind of start the 1 chord by strumming all the strings open together, which if I had to say what is that chord, well, there's a 9th in there and there's a major 7th. But right now it doesn't matter because I'm using it as a passing chord to say, and hammering on the notes that I need for that 1 chord. So now I can do the same, say on the 4 chord. Granted, this one's a little tougher when you have to bar. This one's barring all the notes, but it's a way to start to break up and to diversify what you're able to do with each of these chords. So when you're playing the chords in all the right order, you know, it can sound fine, and you're strumming in a way to utilize the droning strings or the high strings, so that you're kind of creating this low, high, back and forth strumming pattern, which again we talked about in one of the first 2 weeks when I was saying if we just strum all the 6 strings at the same time with the equal amount of dynamics, it doesn't sound that special because it's just all the notes ringing all at the same time. But if we break up how we strum, you know, this works for standard tuning, but also in these alter tunings, whether there's droning strings or not. If we focus on, you know, the lower strings to say, this is the chord I'm playing, we know where we are. But if I start to strum the higher strings, kind of on off beats or whatever, then I'm starting to, like, it's not a drony chord the entire time that I'm strumming. I'm able to like throw in the drones and the suspended notes that I get for free when I use these tunings. So let's hear this when I go to the 5. So it's just like a nice transition when I start using the hammer-ons and pull-offs, because it's not just chord, 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 and the droning strings kind of create this little pedal tone that carries underneath as I move from one chord to the next. So just listen to that. When I lift my fingers up from the C chord, there's some notes that are still ringing, the ones that I wasn't fretting. As soon as I pick those up, the other ones are ringing as I move to the next position, going to the 6th chord. So it's a really wonderful thing, and especially now if we get into doing finger picking stuff, as I mentioned, when you have alter tunings or you have these chord shapes that start to incorporate where there's a half or whole step between an open string and a note that you're fretting, when you're finger picking, it starts to sound more melodic as opposed to just arpeggiating a chord that just goes root, third, fifth, third, root, or whatever combination of your picking pattern. And that's going back to I'm forgetting the weeks now, if that was week 5 when we were showing some picking patterns, 3 and 4 maybe. So if I finger pick this, let's just listen to how some of the things, without even doing hammer-ons and pull-offs, how they start to sound more melodic because of the open strings. So some of it starts to become just built in, and the more that you do that and start to hear where maybe a melody wants to go, maybe the only way to get, or the easiest way to get that melody is to start doing hammer-ons and pull-offs within those chords, which is simply try taking one of the fingers off in one of these chords that you're playing, one of the chord shapes. Now, granted, on these shapes, as we go up the neck, these two fingers are kind of busy holding down the root, the fifth, and the third. So they might not be the first choice to do a hammer-on and pull-off. So if we look at all these shapes, we're usually fretting something on this second string because that open B kind of doesn't work as well over some of the chords. I'll demo that after we talk about this. So if I've got to figure out what options do I have for hammer-ons and pull-offs, let's just focus on where we're fretting on the second string. And then we can go up to the 3 chord. The 4 chord, our fingering changes, but we still have this option. But now with the bar, if your index finger is feeling strong and you've got those notes covered, we've got that hammer-on pull-off as well. Or we've got both. Same for the 5. Now the 6 chord. Now once we get high up here and we start to do a pull-off, when there's such a leap from this fretted note to the open string, it doesn't sound as melodic because it's basically doing a large leap. Although it could serve a purpose and you could find something. And the kind of neat one about this 6 chord going to that open B string, it's really dissonant but jazzy and a cool suspension, which is essentially it's a ninth. It's making it an A9 chord, or A minor add 9, I should say. So there's sometimes that dissonant note that actually you get for free is kind of a really cool character. Was that right for every song? Anytime you want to play an A minor song? Probably not. Like if you're playing a kind of a upbeat, or let's say a bluesy song that's kind of rocking, that sounds like Joni Mitchell to me. So this chord, I'm just saying, so that like if you're trying to rock, having like a weird suspension like that, I shouldn't say weird because I think it's a beautiful suspension. But if you're having that suspension, might not fit the character of the song. However, it might be just the magic sauce that you need to make that one chord really stand out. So, lots of stuff here, and I know this is our last week talking about this tuning. We are at week 9. We've only got one more week left, and by taking each of these tunings and talking about them for 2 weeks, it is still just the tip of the iceberg. Obviously, there's all the theory that we could learn about them. However, again, the goal is to not get too wrapped up in that at this point if you don't have a theory background. Get your ear falling in love with these shapes, fall in love with the sounds. And in the past 3 weeks, some of the handouts that I hope that you printed out after watching the guided practice, some of those things are still going to relate to what we're talking about today. Like there's that a table that helps you figure out if you want to take a song that you're already playing and turn it into this tuning and figure out like, well, how do I know where the chords are now? We had that table that I don't think we're not going to put it up now because I know we've put it up the last 3 weeks. But to say, if your song was in the key of C, that table would tell you that key of C is your 1 chord, and your F would be your 4 chord, and your G would be your 5 chord. So now we just know where those positions are. But if you're saying, okay, but my song is in D, now what do I do? This is where we worked before and said that this is where we can start to use a capo and use these key positions. This is the 1 chord in this position, in this tuning, with the low note being C. Now if I want to play this in the key of D, that's where I would start to bring in, I got to raise all these shapes 1 whole step. So now my lowest note is D, and now I can go back to playing that 1 chord, the 4 chord, and the 5 chord, or that 5 chord. And the same thing's going to work C, or that's the key of D. Another whole step. Then we've got the key of E. Another half step up to the key of F, and I'm just skipping over the keys that are in a sharp or flat. Just obviously they're there in between, but the key of F. Now, again, the benefit of these drop tunings is these low notes a lot of times, in addition to the droning strings. And the higher we capo up, the more low notes, or the less low notes we get. So there's going to be a limit to how far up you may want to capo. There may be a limit to how far up you can capo, because if you have a 12 fret guitar, which I've said before, you won't get much past the 9th fret. So if that puts me in the key of F, I could, yes, go another whole step up to the key of G, another whole step up to the key of A, and it's still, obviously these chord shapes are still going to sound the same, but once I get up here, I can't, it's really hard to get up to that 4 position. I've got a cutaway so I can actually reach it. Just to say, you're going to find your comfort level on how high up you're willing to capo. But the great thing about learning each of these tunings out of at least 2 different keys is that we know, last week we learned it out of the G position, this week C position. So we've got C, D, E, F, and maybe I don't want to capo higher than that. And if my song is in G, then I could say, well, I could capo it up and play it there, or I can go back to this tuning, the C tuning, in the G position with no capo. I get all these low strings back, and then I can play my go up my chord shapes up the scale. 4, 5, 6, 1. So now, just by playing out of those 2 key positions, I've got them all available to me, and I can try them both. If my song is in D, chances are I'm going to play it out of this C position with the capo on the 2nd fret, because the only way to play the C tuning in the G position from last week in the actual key of D, I've got a capo all the way up, G, A, B, C, D, up on the 7th fret, which does work. But again, we've lost the low bass notes. So it at least affords you the ability to try it out of different positions. Do you like the higher capoed sound, or do you want to keep those low notes? Are you playing guitar with somebody else? Are they already playing along and holding down the low end? If so, maybe you do want to try a higher capoed version to kind of create that contrast. Your higher, more chimey guitar, but it also has all these droning notes and interesting sounding voicings that will contrast themselves and yet work really well with somebody else playing the lower chords in standard tuning or another tuning. If you wanted to do that, that would be really cool as well. So let's see. There was okay, I'm going to demonstrate this other thing. We talked about the hammer-ons. These are kind of like some of the other little tricks that we can do to further diversify playing out of this position. I showed a little bit of this last week, and this is not on the chord charts. Actually, this one, it will be on the chord charts. The one I demonstrated last week, we tuned our low string down to B and showed how we could move the bass note. But this is going to be, again, going back to using the partial capo, or the drop D capo, essentially what it's called, and that name is more relates to how it's used in standard tuning. But when I use this in this position, I could say, playing this tuning out of the key of C position, it's because I've got that low bass note as the root of my 1 chord. Now, I could say, if we look at that chord chart, another way to play the 1 chord is like that. Remember, this is the top 5 strings are essentially, when I'm not fretting it, is an open G chord. So if I just bar it, there's a D, E, F. Oh, I'm sorry, this is off of the G. G, A, B, C. So now I'm turning this open position shape into a C, but I still have that bass note. So if I've got a partial capo, the drop D capo, again, which if you need one, you can find them at your stores, or you can go to justinroth.bandcamp.com, and I've got them available there as well. So now, this is covering the top 5 strings, and my low bass note rings past here because it's cut out. There's a hole there in the capo so that this rings all the way down to here. So now I've got the low C chord. But now my one position, the one position for my root chord, is essentially looks like the one chord when we play in this C tuning in the G position, which we did last week. Because I could say, if that's my one, then my two is gonna, we're kind of using this tuning out of the G position, but we're capoed up. But I get the bonus of having the low bass note underneath it. And that 4 chord, again, because this capo isn't covering that bass note, I've got to actually reach behind the capo to get it. So there we go. So now that's another way to connect from playing this C tuning in the C position with no capo down here, or still playing in the key of C but playing it out of the G position where our one chord is now starting there and we build up from there. So that kind of like brings us back to what we learned, the shapes we learned last week, but getting to utilize this low bass note underneath it. So, and then we've got if that was using the capo as we go up, C, D, E, F, and then our G is our open if we want to go back to the G position, and then we could capo up from there to play in the key of A, the key of B, another whole step up, another half step up to the key of C. So we've made a full circle, and we've got all those keys available to us, and of course the ones in between with sharps and flats. So this is kind of moving fast. This is a lot. I know there's a lot of material to cover. Hopefully the guided practices have been helpful to get you not only focusing on ear training to get in and out of the tunings, but also to be practicing those shapes and learning from changing from one chord to the next as you play with those tracks that has the drum loop and the bass line to help for you to follow along, and as the tempo increases, and you'll have that one more time this week to be applying these new chord shapes to that track in the key of C now, which is one key that we have not done any of those other tracks to. So are there any other questions that are coming up at this point?
We don't have any more questions.
Okay.
As a reminder, guys, towards the end of this lesson, if you have general guitar questions, those are okay.
They can be about anything. They don't have to be about this tuning.
You could ask Justin his moisturizer preferences.
Or the need for it.
Or the need for moisturizer. His fingernail care routine.
I could ask you guys for suggestions.
Yeah, why don't you guys give us your moisturizer suggestions?
That's guitar related, although I can't do that right before guitar because then the strings get all greasy, especially if you got new strings, you don't want to do that. Yeah, so we've got one more week, and it's that next week is going to be kind of covering just some kind of tidbits, kind of miscellaneous tidbits of different techniques that you can try out, some percussive techniques and things to kind of expand on some of the things that we've spent time on in the last 9 weeks. So if there aren't any other questions, I think I'm going to wrap it up here. I've really enjoyed talking with you guys. I look forward to our final week next week, so come back Thursday at 4 o'clock, and we will carry on and put a nice little bow on the end of this stuff, and hopefully at the end, instead of a bow, maybe we'll close the lid, or open the lid rather, to this new toolkit or toolbox of different things that you can try on any and all of your songs, and pick and choose using your own subjective judgment of like, what do you like, when does it benefit your song, when do you like your song the way it originally was before we tried sprinkling any of this magic fairy dust on it. All this stuff is to be used at your own discretion, to your own taste, and in the end, my hope is that the things that we've learned in this course have just expanded where your ear wants to take your songs by trying out some or a combination of these techniques. So,
all right, we did ask people for any questions.
Okay,
and we were being nonsensical. So Danson Diane RN says, "Why does Justin wear the watch the way he does? Wear his watch the way he does? And did he get a haircut?"
I did get a haircut yesterday. I know. I was pretty shaggy the last few weeks. So thanks for noticing. My wife is very happy that I got a haircut. And the watch, wearing it this way. There is a very specific reason why I do this. And this is actually a trick I learned from David Wilcox, again, who uses a lot of these tunings. This was a non-guitar related trick that I learned from him. I wear my watch with the face on the inside because I do a lot of performing. And when I'm playing a show, there's nothing more tacky when you're watching somebody play, and they look at their watch to be like, "Am I done yet?" Or how long has it been? Or maybe like, "Oh, it's only been 10 minutes. I feel or it's been an hour. It feels like 10 minutes." Still, looking at the watch, it can be a real distraction. So I wear it this way because when you're playing guitar, nobody thinks twice if you're looking at your hand for a moment. And right there, I've got my watch. I can see what time it is. Not because I'm trying to figure out when I can get out of here, but it just becomes a convenient thing that just seems less obvious than doing this, whether it's on stage or with a group of people or whatever. So yeah, it's very purposeful and effective and helpful for me. So good question. It actually is guitar related.
She did say you're welcome in regards to the haircut.
All right.
So
yeah.
And that is it, folks.
All right. Well, we will see you next week, and happy playing, and good luck with those tracks, and get these chord shapes. Again, a lot of these shapes were similar to last week, so hopefully it's not a huge leap. Just putting them in different combinations, and get your fingers used to it, fall in love with those sounds, and we'll see you next week and wrap things up. All right. So long.